Thank you, Madam President. I come before you actually first and foremost to thank Senator Inhofe for his great leadership as the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and a special thanks to the staff who are working very, very hard to process the hundreds of amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act that came out of the committee with broad bipartisan support. I'm here to talk specifically about some provisions that I think are pretty important that actually started in the Personnel Subcommittee. I chair the Personnel Subcommittee for Senate Armed Services, and early this year we heard of what I consider to be absolutely unacceptable conditions in military housing across the country. In North Carolina, Madam President, in your great state of Tennessee, you know that we have bases, we have military housing, we have men and women, many of them very young. Oftentimes the spouses are deployed, so the families back home to take care of their children, take care of their own jobs, and living on the base. But about February, we got reports, and these are not just one-off reports. These are reports across the country of mold, mildew, damage from storms, all kinds of conditions that I think in the private sector you would find objectionable. I think it's particularly objectionable when you're talking about people whose families are with that husband or wife who's serving in the military or serving this country. So we decided to have a number of hearings where we brought the private housing providers into the Senate and my personnel subcommittee and the full committee to get an explanation. And quite honestly, there wasn't a good explanation. Back in about 1996, the federal government decided to get out of the housing business. I'm glad they did because they were doing a really bad job. And for about 10 years, we had a great story to tell in terms of the quality of housing, the service to the tenants, and the satisfaction of the military families. But then something got sideways in a very, very bad way. When you see, this is a shower. When you see this kind of mold and mildew in your shower, would you think it's acceptable? If you go in and you see children's toys, and this is actually the bottom side of a crib, mold and mildew in these folks' housings with small children in it, people with respiratory conditions, living in these kind of conditions, I expect the garrison down at the bases, and I expect the private housing providers to move heaven and earth to eliminate these sorts of problems. We are making progress, but I feel like in order to make sure it's just not progress that's being made while they all of a sudden get the attention of this senator and other members of the U.S. Senate, we have to change the rules in terms of the authorities that the Department of Defense has and the expectations that we have for the private housing providers. I have to give now the Acting Secretary of Defense, formerly the Secretary of the Army, and all the service secretaries for stepping up. They've created a tenant bill of rights, and they've created a dispute process. They've demanded a more timely and more transparent method for actually solving service requests. All of those now have language in this National Defense Authorization Act that Congress needs to act quickly on so that we can make sure that we put into place the right expectations in the statute to make sure that the problems that exist today are fixed and that they don't happen again. Now, I will tell you that while we're making progress, I know when I go down to Fort Bragg and I go down to Camp Lejeune, I've held what they call sensing sessions, which are basically getting a few dozen people together and hear their complaints. There's an amazing thing that happens when I go down in North Carolina. I don't know, Madam President, if you've done one of these in Tennessee yet, but if you announce that you're going to come down and hear from the tenants, there's an amazing thing that happens. You got all these service requests are about here when they announce that I'm coming to Jacksonville or I'm coming to Fayetteville. About a day or two before I get there, magically, they've been able to solve almost all these service requests. And then I go away for a couple of months and I see them coming back up again. Well, one thing that everybody who's listening, and this is not just the private housing providers, it's the Department of Defense and Congress that all, I think, shifted their focus away from this problem, and we've got to maintain a focus on it. So for my part, I just spoke with my scheduling director and my state staff. I told them I want to take the next sensing session up a level. I want a town hall. I want to be able to put 200 or 300 families with housing down in Jacksonville at Camp Lejeune and down at Fort Bragg and Fayetteville. I want to put them in a room, and I want to make it very clear to everybody involved, whether it's the private housing provider, the garrison commanders, the Department of Defense, and put a light on us in Congress where it's our inaction that's caused the problem. We want to know what their problems are. We're going to hear from hundreds of people. We're going to make progress on these kinds of things through the provisions in the NDA, but we've still got to continue to focus on this problem. And Madam President, the last thing, first off, I want to thank Senator Inhofe. He did a great job in terms of casting light on this, and I know I've got the commitment of the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, but I don't want these just to be words on the floor. I want them to be words that are put into action in terms of how we can help these military families today. If you have a service request outstanding with any vendor and you don't feel like you're getting a prompt response, I want you to write down tillis.senate.gov. We will treat every single housing request you have as a request for casework in my office, and I will have one of several dozen staff in my office open up a case and track it until it's complete. And anybody else who knows a service member that has this problem, who thinks they won't have somebody that'll follow up on it, give me a chance, because we've already solved a lot of them and we're going to solve a lot more, and we're not going to finish until I believe that the men and women and the families at Fort Bragg, Camp Lejeune, and bases across this country have the safe and comfortable housing that they deserve. So, Madam President, thank you very much. I yield the floor.